Ever found yourself daydreaming about a life of adventure on the vast, sun-scorched plains of the American West? It's a powerful and enduring fantasy, casting you as the heroic figure silhouetted against a dramatic sunset. Perhaps a steely-eyed lawman, a resilient pioneer, or a lone rider of the purple sage. This captivating image, heavily polished and promoted by a century of Hollywood films, paints a picture of thrilling duels and epic cattle drives. However, this popular portrayal is largely a myth, a carefully constructed mirage that obscures a much grittier and more unforgiving truth. Before you start polishing your spurs, let's peel back the layers of this romantic fiction to expose the stark reality of the 1870s frontier. The day-to-day existence for the average person was a relentless battle against the elements. Disease and misfortune were the greatest threats, weren't from outlaws' bullets, but from the mundane, yet lethal, challenges of simply staying alive. This exploration won't focus on the sensationalized tales of gunfighters, but on the quiet, brutal realities that defined life and death in an era of immense hardship. Forget the image of the grizzled, long-lived cowboy. The stark reality is that life in the American West was brutally short. For men who reached adulthood, the average life expectancy hovered grimly in the mid-30s, a number that plummeted even lower for women who faced the extreme dangers of childbirth without modern medical care. The romanticized gunfights that dominate Western movies were a relatively minor cause of death. The true killers were far more insidious and widespread. Diseases we now consider treatable, such as cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery, swept through settlements with terrifying speed, thriving in the unsanitary conditions that were the norm. A simple infection from a minor cut could easily become a death sentence. Accidents from a misplaced axe, swing to a fall from a horse, were commonplace and often fatal. The West wasn't a land of heroic duels at high noon. It was a place where life was fragile and death was a constant, unimposing neighbor, arriving quietly in the form of sickness or a sudden, unfortunate mishap. The most formidable adversary on the frontier wasn't a black-hatted villain, but the invisible armies of germs that waged a relentless war on the population. Imagine a world without antibiotics, sanitation systems, or a basic understanding of germ theory. This was the reality of the 1870s West. Cholera, a terrifying waterborne illness, could turn a thriving community into a ghost town in a matter of weeks, causing rapid, agonizing death through dehydration. Outbreaks were frequent and devastating, leaving a trail of grief and terror. Typhoid fever, another bacterial disease, spread through contaminated food and water, was a slow, debilitating killer. Smallpox, the dreaded spotted death, arrived with newcomers and swept through vulnerable populations, leaving survivors scarred for life. Even common childhood diseases like measles and whooping cough were major threats, carrying mortality rates that would be unthinkable today. Without the medical knowledge to combat these microscopic enemies, settlers were left to rely on folk remedies and prayers, often watching helplessly as their loved ones succumbed to illnesses we now cure with a simple prescription. The daily diet on the frontier was a monotonous and nutritionally barren landscape, a far cry from the hearty stews and sizzling steaks of campfire legends. For the iconic cowboy on a long cattle drive, the menu was brutally repetitive. Day after day, meals consisted of little more than beef, beans, and biscuits, all washed down with strong, bitter coffee. This unvarying diet, almost completely devoid of fruits and vegetables, was a recipe for nutritional deficiencies. The most feared of these was scurvy, a gruesome disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. Its symptoms were horrific: bleeding gums, loose teeth, excruciating joint pain, and wounds that refused to heal. It was a slow, agonizing way to die, and it haunted trail crews and isolated homesteaders alike. The chuckwagon, often romanticized as the heart of the trail drive, was in reality a mobile dispensary of a diet that slowly crippled and killed the very men it was meant to sustain. The lack of dietary diversity wasn't a matter of preference. It was a harsh necessity that had deadly consequences. Beyond the cattle drives, the challenge of securing a varied and nutritious diet was a constant struggle for all frontier inhabitants. For homesteaders, life was a gamble against the elements. A single hailstorm could wipe out a season's crop of vegetables, and a drought could parch the land, leaving families with little more than flour and salted meat to survive the winter. Miners, often working in remote and isolated camps, were at the mercy of merchants who charged exorbitant prices for basic supplies. A simple can of tomatoes could cost a day's wages, making fresh produce an unattainable luxury. This chronic lack of access to essential vitamins and minerals made the population susceptible to a host of illnesses beyond scurvy. Weakened immune systems were less able to fight off infections, turning common colds into life-threatening pneumonia. The relentless struggle for basic sustenance meant that for many, life was a state of perpetual hunger and nutritional stress, a reality far removed from the cinematic image of the well-fed, robust pioneer. In an era before the Food and Drug Administration, the American West was a dumping ground for all manner of dubious medical concoctions, known as patent medicines. These attractively packaged bottles and tins promised miracle cures for everything from consumption to cancer, preying on the desperation of the sick and isolated. Lacking any scientific basis, their formulas were often a dangerous cocktail of high-proof alcohol, opium, morphine, and even cocaine. Products like Perry Davis's painkiller were little more than opiates suspended in alcohol, offering temporary relief while fostering addiction. Histedder's stomach bitters was 47% alcohol, making it more potent than whiskey, and a popular medicine in dry counties. These substances didn't cure diseases. They merely masked the symptoms, creating a generation of unwitting addicts who believed they were taking legitimate medicine. The absence of regulation turned the medicine cabinet into a source of immense danger, where the cure was often as deadly as the disease it claimed to treat. If the state of medicine was dire, the condition of dental care on the frontier was positively barbaric. There were no smiling dentists with comfortable chairs and anesthetic. Instead, a toothache was a terrifying ordeal that often ended in a brutal extraction performed by the local blacksmith or a traveling tooth puller, whose primary qualifications were a strong arm and a sturdy pair of pliers. There was no concept of saving a tooth. The only solution was to pull it. Anesthesia was a rare luxury, meaning most patients endured the procedure fully conscious, with only a swig of whiskey to numb the senses. The tools were crude, unsterilized, and often consisted of fearsome-looking turnkey extractors that could easily fracture the jaw or leave behind shards of broken root, leading to life-threatening infections. Given these horrific realities, it's no surprise that many settlers chose to endure the chronic pain of a rotten tooth for as long as possible, rather than face the blacksmith's pliers. The American West has long been defined by the powerful myth of rugged individualism. and boundless opportunity a land where anyone with grit and determination could strike it rich. This alluring narrative fueled the westward migration of hundreds of thousands of hopefuls, each chasing their own version of the American dream. The gold rush prospector, the ambitious cowboy, and the determined homesteader became iconic figures in this national mythology. They were portrayed as masters of their own destiny, carving out fortunes from the wilderness through sheer force of will. However, this romanticized vision conveniently ignores the harsh economic realities that governed life on the frontier. For the vast majority, the West was not a land of easy riches, but a place of relentless toil, financial hardship, and crushing disappointment. The dream of independence was often a mirage, masking a system where the odds were heavily stacked against the very individuals who embodied the frontier spirit. The California Gold Rush is the quintessential story of striking it rich in the West. But for the average prospector, it was a fast track to failure. The romantic image of a lone miner panning a fortune in gold nuggets from a sparkling stream is a dramatic exception, not the rule. The reality was that most of the easily accessible surface gold was gone within the first few years. Those who arrived later faced the backbreaking labor of deep rock mining, often as poorly paid wage laborers for large corporations. The truly staggering fortunes weren't made by the men who swung the pickaxes, but by the shrewd merchants who sold them the supplies. Men like Sam Brannett, who cornered the market on mining tools, and Levi Strauss, who catered to the miners' need for durable clothing, became millionaires. They understood that the real gold wasn't in the hills, but in the pockets of the hopefuls who flocked there. For every miner who struck a modest claim, thousands went broke, returning home with nothing but shattered dreams and broken health. The life of a cowboy, romanticized in countless books and films, was in reality a low-wage, high-risk job with little chance for advancement. For months on end, these men endured grueling conditions on the trail, facing stampedes, river crossings, and extreme weather, all for about $1 a day. While they toiled, the real profits were being raked in by the cattle barons and East Coast investors who owned the herds. A successful cattle drive could generate enormous wealth for its owner, but the cowboys who made it possible saw only a tiny fraction of that fortune. They were the disposable labor force of a massive, speculative industry. A single stampede, often triggered by a sudden storm or a predator, could wipe out a significant portion of a herd, representing a huge financial loss for the owner. But for the cowboy, it represented the immediate, life-threatening danger of being trampled to death. The cowboy wasn't a free-roaming hero. He was a working-class laborer in a dangerous and exploitative industry. The Homestead Act of 1862 was hailed as a democratic triumph, offering 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to settle and cultivate it. It promised a pathway to independence and prosperity for millions. Yet, for a staggering number of homesteaders, this dream turned into a nightmare of failure and despair. The challenges were immense and often insurmountable. The unforgiving climate of the Great Plains, with its searing droughts, brutal winters, and violent storms, was a constant adversary. The soil was often difficult to farm, and the lack of trees made building a home and fencing the land an expensive and arduous task. Perhaps most devastating of all were the plagues of grasshoppers that swept across the plains in the 1870, descending in biblical swarms that consumed everything in their path: crops, clothing, even the handles of farming tools. More than half of all homestead claims ultimately failed, forcing settlers to abandon their land, often deeply in debt, and with their spirits broken by the harsh realities of frontier agriculture. The railroad, often celebrated as the great engine of Western expansion, was a double-edged sword for the farmers it claimed to serve. While the trains provided a vital link to Eastern markets, they also created a system of economic dependency that trapped and exploited many homesteaders. The railroad companies, having received vast tracts of land from the government as an incentive to build, held a virtual monopoly over transportation. They could, and did, charge exorbitant freight rates, often costing a farmer more to ship his grain to market than he had earned growing it. This price gouging was particularly egregious in areas served by only one rail line, leaving farmers with no alternative. They were forced to accept whatever price the railroad dictated, often pushing them to the brink of bankruptcy. The very entity that made their agricultural enterprise possible was also the one squeezing the life out of it, leading to widespread resentment and the rise of populist movements demanding regulation and reform. The romantic myth of the Wild West often presents a world populated almost exclusively by white, Anglo-Saxon men. This is a profound distortion of a much more complex and diverse reality. The frontier was a vibrant mosaic of cultures and ethnicities, a place where people from all corners of the globe converged, each contributing to the fabric of Western society. Chinese immigrants were instrumental in building the transcontinental railroad, performing the most dangerous tasks for low pay and facing relentless discrimination. 1 in 4 cowboys was black, bringing skills learned in the cattle industries of the South to the great trail drives of the West. Mexican vaqueros were the original cowboys, and their traditions, language, and techniques shaped the entire cattle industry. Women, far from being passive bystanders, were active participants in every aspect of frontier life, running farms, businesses, and households under incredibly difficult circumstances. Acknowledging this diversity is crucial to understanding the true story of the West. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century, rests on the shoulders of thousands of Chinese laborers who have been largely erased from the popular narrative. Recruited to perform the most grueling and hazardous work, they faced brutal conditions and systemic racism. They were paid less than their white counterparts and were forced to work longer hours, often taking on the treacherous task of blasting tunnels through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Hundreds lost their lives in explosions, landslides, and avalanches. Despite their indispensable contributions, their role was minimized and their presence resented. They were denied the right to citizenship and became the targets of discriminatory laws and mob violence. The completion of the railroad was a moment of national triumph, but for the Chinese workers who made it possible, it was a legacy of exploitation and a stark reminder of their precarious place in a nation they helped to build. The iconic image of the American cowboy is almost invariably white, a myth perpetuated by Hollywood that ignores a vital chapter of Western history. The reality is that the cattle trails were far more diverse than we've been led to believe. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys who rode the trails out of Texas was African American. Many were former slaves who possessed extensive experience working with cattle and horses, skills that were in high demand in the post-Civil War era. They served in all capacities, from trail cooks to top hands and rodeo stars, while the open range offered a degree of freedom and opportunity unavailable in the segregated South. Black cowboys still faced prejudice and discrimination. They were often paid less than their white counterparts and faced social segregation in the towns they visited. Figures like Nat Love, a former slave who became a celebrated cowboy and author, challenge the whitewashed myth and reveal the complex, multicultural reality of the cowboy life. The story of westward expansion is also a story of conquest and displacement, particularly for the Mexican families who had lived in the Southwest for generations. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, promised to protect the property rights of Mexican citizens who chose to remain in the newly acquired U.S. territories. This promise was systematically broken through a combination of legal chicanery, fraudulent land claims, and outright violence. Anglo-American settlers, lawyers, and politicians dispossessed thousands of Mexican landowners, known as Californios, of their ancestral lands. The complex and expensive process of proving land titles in a foreign legal system, coupled with discriminatory taxes and economic pressure, forced many to sell their vast ranchos for a fraction of their value. This massive transfer of land and wealth fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape of the Southwest, relegating many Mexican families to a position of poverty and marginalization in a land that was once their own. The American West is often perceived as a man's world, but women were far from passive figures in this historical drama. In fact, the frontier offered women legal and political opportunities that were unheard of in the more civilized East, while the legal doctrine of femme covert, which subsumed a married woman's legal identity into that of her husband, still held sway in much of the country. Western territories and states were pioneers in granting women greater rights, seeking to attract female settlers and stabilize their communities. Western legislatures were the first to pass laws allowing married women to own and control their own property. This legal innovation culminated in the territory of Wyoming granting women the right to vote in 1869, a full 50 years before the 19th Amendment. This progressive stance on women's suffrage was a pragmatic recognition of their vital role as equal partners in the arduous task of building a new society from the ground up. The image of the Wild West as a lawless land of constant gunfights is one of the most persistent and misleading myths of the era. While violence was certainly a part of frontier life, the dusty streets of cattle towns were not the chaotic shooting galleries portrayed in film. In fact, the most famous frontier towns, like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood, had some of the strictest gun control laws in the nation. Upon entering town limits, visitors were typically required to check their firearms with the local sheriff or at a designated depository. Ordinances against carrying concealed weapons were common and strictly enforced. The goal of civic leaders was to create a stable environment for commerce, and they understood that unchecked gun violence was bad for business. While shootouts did occur, they were relatively rare events. The reality was that a person was more likely to die from a disease or an accident than in a gunfight, a fact that stands in stark contrast to the West's violent reputation. When formal law enforcement was absent or perceived as ineffective, frontier communities often took the law into their own hands through the formation of vigilante committees. These groups, typically composed of the town's leading citizens and business owners, saw themselves as restoring order and protecting property in a lawless environment, while some vigilante actions were aimed at suppressing crime and punishing notorious outlaws. They often operated without due process, delivering swift and brutal justice at the end of a rope. The line between maintaining order and mob rule was frequently blurred. Vigilantism could be used to settle personal scores, eliminate business rivals, or enforce a particular social or racial hierarchy. The San Francisco Vigilance Committee of the 1850 and the Montana Vigilantes of the 1860 are famous examples of this phenomenon, where citizen groups executed dozens of individuals with little or no legal authority, embodying the dark and often arbitrary nature of frontier justice. The romantic mythology of the American West, with its heroic cowboys and noble pioneers, serves to obscure a darker, more troubling history of systematic violence and cultural destruction directed against Native American populations. This wasn't a story of glorious battles and fair fights, but one of broken treaties, forced removals, and calculated extermination. The official policy of the U.S. government was one of expansion, and Native Americans were seen as an obstacle to be removed. The U.S. Army was not just a peacekeeping force. It was an instrument of conquest, waging a brutal campaign of total war against tribes who dared to resist. The forced relocation of entire nations, like the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, and the massacres of non-combatants, such as the slaughter of Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek, reveal a pattern of state-sanctioned violence that is often sanitized or ignored in popular tellings of the westward expansion story. One of the most devastating strategies employed by the U.S. government to subjugate the Plains Indians was the deliberate extermination of the American bison. These magnificent animals were the cornerstone of the Plains tribes' existence, providing food, shelter, clothing, and spiritual sustenance. Military and political leaders recognized that by destroying the bison, they could destroy the independence of the native peoples who relied on them. The policy was brutally effective. Encouraged by the government, commercial hunters descended on the plains, slaughtering bison by the millions for their hides alone, leaving the carcasses to rot. Railroads even offered special excursion trains for tourists to shoot bison from their windows. General Philip Sheridan himself is reported to have said, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." By the late 1880, the once mighty herds, numbering in the tens of millions, had been reduced to a few hundred, and the Plains tribes were left starving, dependent, and broken. After military conquest came a campaign of cultural genocide, embodied by the creation of off-reservation boarding schools for Native American children. The most famous of these was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt. The school's explicit philosophy, as articulated by Pratt, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man-children were forcibly taken from their families and transported hundreds of miles from their homes. Upon arrival, their traditional clothing was burned, their long hair was cut, and they were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their cultural and spiritual traditions. The curriculum focused on vocational training and assimilation into white American society. While proponents argued they were providing an education, the reality was a systematic effort to erase indigenous identity, resulting in profound psychological trauma, cultural alienation, and the disruption of families and communities for generations to come. The history of U.S. Native American relations in the 19th century is a litany of broken promises. The U.S. government signed hundreds of treaties with Native tribes, solemnly guaranteeing them rights to specific lands. For as long as the grass shall grow, these treaties were not gifts, but legal agreements made between sovereign nations. Yet, time and again, they were violated by the United States as soon as the land became desirable for settlement, ranching, or mining. A prime example is the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which guaranteed the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho ownership of the Black Hills in perpetuity. Just a few years later, when gold was discovered in the hills, the U.S. government reneged on the treaty, sending in the army to protect white prospectors and forcibly seizing the land. This pattern of duplicity and bad faith shattered any possibility of trust and fueled the cycles of violence that characterized the era, leaving a legacy of injustice that continues to this day. The popular image of the Wild West was not forged in the crucible of reality, but in the pages of cheap, sensationalized dime novels. These mass-produced paperbacks, which sold for 5 or 10 cents, captivated an Eastern audience hungry for tales of adventure on the frontier. They presented a highly fictionalized world of heroic gunslingers, noble savages, and daring rescues. Real-life figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and Calamity Jane were transformed into larger-than-life characters, their exploits wildly exaggerated to fit a dramatic narrative. These stories created a powerful and enduring mythology that had little to do with the daily grind of life in the West. They simplified complex realities into a simple morality play of good versus evil, establishing the archetypes and plot lines that would dominate Western entertainment for the next century. The myth, it turned out, was far more entertaining and profitable than the mundane and often brutal truth. No single person did more to invent and popularize the myth of the Wild West than William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, a former Army scout and bison hunter. Cody was a master showman who understood the public's appetite for frontier spectacle. His Wild West show, which began touring in the 1880s, was a theatrical extravaganza that brought a sanitized and sensationalized version of the frontier to audiences across America and Europe. The show featured thrilling reenactments of stagecoach robberies, Indian attacks, and Pony Express rides, often starring real-life figures like Sitting Bull and Annie Oakley. While advertised as an authentic portrayal of Western life, it was pure entertainment, carefully choreographed to maximize drama and excitement. It cemented the image of the cowboy as a heroic sharpshooter and presented a romanticized, conflict-driven narrative that ignored the complexities of history, the hardships of daily life, and the brutal realities of westward expansion. Buffalo Bill's show wasn't a reflection of the West. It was the creation of a legend. The cinematic image of the West, pioneered by early silent films and solidified by the classic Hollywood era, took the myths forged by dime novels and Buffalo Bill shows and elevated them to a new level of cultural dominance. Early films like The Great Train Robbery, 1903, were revolutionary in their storytelling, but they also established a simplistic narrative framework that would define the genre for decades. This framework relied on a clear-cut battle between good and evil, personified by the heroic, white-hatted cowboy and the villainous, black-hatted outlaw. The complex historical realities, the economic struggles, the racial diversity, the systematic displacement of native peoples were completely erased in favor of action-packed, morally unambiguous tales of adventure. This cinematic West was a fantasy landscape, a powerful and enduring piece of American folklore that shaped public perception far more than any history book ever could, creating a shared cultural memory of a West that never truly existed. As the Western genre evolved, it became a powerful vehicle for exploring and reinforcing core American values, or at least the values America wished to see in itself. The lone cowboy, self-reliant and unbound by the constraints of a corrupt or over-civilized society, became a potent symbol of American individualism. The vast, open landscape of the cinematic West represented the promise of freedom, manifest destiny, and the nation's boundless potential. These films, particularly in the post-World War Roman II era, often served as Cold War allegories, with the righteous lawman standing firm against the forces of chaos and anarchy. By projecting these ideals onto a mythologized past, Hollywood created a national origin story that was both reassuring and deeply patriotic. The cowboy hero wasn't just a character. He was the embodiment of the American spirit, a rugged individualist taming a wild frontier and, by extension, validating the nation's journey and its place in the world. The romanticized violence of the Hollywood Western bears little resemblance to the grim reality of life and death on the frontier. In the movies, the gunfight is a highly stylized ritual, a dramatic climax where skill and courage determine the outcome. The hero is a reluctant but supremely skilled gunman who only draws his weapon in the name of justice. The reality was far messier, more brutal, and less honorable. Death was more often the result of a drunken brawl, a back alley ambush, or an accidental discharge than a formal duel at high noon. Furthermore, the cinematic focus on gun violence completely overshadows the true leading causes of death. The frontier's most prolific killers were not outlaws, but diseases like cholera and dysentery, accidents involving horses or farm equipment, and the sheer physical toll of malnutrition and overwork. The Western mythos transforms the mundane, tragic reality of premature death into a spectacle of heroic violence, a narrative choice that sanitizes the past and glorifies a culture of gunplay. The Hollywood cowboy is an idealized figure, a knight of the prairie who lives by a strict code of honor. He is brave, chivalrous, and always on the side of the righteous, a portrayal that is almost entirely a cinematic invention. The historical cowboy was a migratory agricultural laborer, often young and uneducated, working a physically demanding, low-paying job under harsh conditions. While some were undoubtedly decent men, the population also included drifters, opportunists, and fugitives from the law. The chivalrous respect for women, so often depicted on screen, was hardly the norm in a society where women were scarce, and the sex trade flourished. The cowboy's primary concerns were not rescuing damsels in distress, but surviving the brutal hardships of the trail, earning his meager pay, and finding an outlet for his frustrations in the rough-and-tumble cattle towns. The myth strips away the grit, the poverty, and the moral ambiguity of their lives, replacing it with a clean, heroic fantasy. The cinematic portrayal of Native Americans is one of the most damaging and persistent falsehoods of the Western genre. For decades, films depicted them not as diverse nations, with rich cultures and complex societies, but as a monolithic, savage enemy. They were often portrayed as primitive, bloodthirsty warriors, an obstacle to the triumphant march of civilization. This racist caricature served a crucial narrative purpose. It justified the violence perpetrated against them. By dehumanizing native peoples, the films transformed a brutal story of conquest and ethnic cleansing into a heroic tale of brave settlers defending their families from faceless aggressors. The historical context, the broken treaties, the theft of land, the extermination of the bison, was completely ignored. This cinematic slander not only distorted the past, but also fueled prejudice and misconceptions that have lingered for generations, leaving a legacy of harm that continues to be challenged and dismantled today. The classic Western narrative consistently frames westward expansion as a story of progress and destiny, a process guided by the hand of providence. This concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent, is the ideological bedrock of the genre. The films present the settlement of the West as an empty land, ripe for the taking, conveniently ignoring the fact that it was already inhabited by hundreds of sovereign native nations and long-established Hispanic communities. This narrative transforms settlers from invaders into pioneers, and conquest into a natural, inevitable process of taming the wilderness. By celebrating this expansion as a national triumph, the genre implicitly validates the displacement and destruction of the cultures that stood in its path. It's a powerful and self-serving mythology that recasts a complex and often brutal history as a simple, heroic, and divinely sanctioned adventure. The gritty reality of frontier towns stands in stark contrast to the sanitized versions seen in most Western films. The typical movie town is a simple, clean set with a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a general store. The real cattle towns and mining camps were chaotic, filthy, and overflowing with the raw realities of 19th century life. Streets were unpaved rivers of mud or choking dust, littered with animal waste and garbage. Sanitation was non-existent, and the stench of open sewers and animal carcasses would have been overwhelming. Saloons were not just places for a clean drink. They were often rough establishments that doubled as brothels and gambling dens, filled with desperate men. The ever-present threat of disease, a consequence of the filth and overcrowding, was a far greater danger than the occasional gunfight. The cinematic West erases the dirt, the disease, and the desperation, presenting a quaint and orderly vision of places that were, in reality, rough, dangerous, and profoundly unsanitary. The economic lifeblood of the cinematic West often seems to revolve around cattle drives and gold rushes, but this focus obscures the diverse and often exploitative economic systems that truly defined the frontier. The Western myth celebrates the independent prospector and the free-roaming cowboy, but it largely ignores the powerful corporate interests that quickly came to dominate the region's resources. Mining became the domain of large, heavily capitalized companies that employed miners for low wages in dangerous conditions. The cattle industry was controlled by wealthy barons and distant investors, not the men on the trail. Railroads, holding vast power through land grants and transportation monopolies, squeezed farmers and ranchers with exorbitant rates. The myth of the rugged individualist masks the reality that the West was the first great resource colony of American industrial capitalism, a place where the pursuit of wealth for the few often meant exploitation and hardship for the many. While classic westerns sometimes feature strong female characters, they are typically confined to a few limiting archetypes: the virtuous schoolmarm, the saloon girl with a heart of gold, or the damsel in distress, waiting for a male hero to save her. This narrow portrayal completely fails to capture the immense diversity and crucial importance of women's roles on the frontier. Women were not passive spectators. They were active agents in every aspect of settlement. They were homesteaders, ranchers, entrepreneurs, doctors, and political activists. They managed households, ran businesses, and built communities. Their labor, resilience, and adaptability were essential to the survival of their families and the development of Western society. By reducing women to simplistic stereotypes, the traditional Western myth erases their contributions and presents a skewed and incomplete picture of a world they were instrumental in creating. The legal landscape of the Hollywood West is a world of simple justice, where the town sheriff is the sole embodiment of the law. This simplification ignores the complex and often contradictory legal systems that existed on the frontier. While formal law did spread westward, it was often slow, inconsistent, and ill-equipped to handle the unique challenges of the region. This led to the rise of alternative forms of justice, from the informal codes of conduct on cattle drives to the brutal finality of vigilante committees. Moreover, the law was frequently used as a tool of oppression. Treaties with Native American nations were systematically violated, and legal systems were manipulated to dispossess Mexican landowners of their property. The cinematic myth of the honorable sheriff bringing order to a lawless land is a comforting fiction that masks a much more complicated reality of legal pluralism, institutional weakness, and systemic injustice. The enduring power of the Western myth lies in its ability to offer a simplified, morally clear version of a complex and often morally ambiguous past. It creates a national origin story that is both heroic and reassuring. It tells Americans that their country was forged by rugged individualists, that progress was inevitable, and that the violence of expansion was a necessary and justifiable part of taming a wilderness and building a great nation. This mythology smooths over the rough edges of history: the genocide of native peoples, the exploitation of labor, the environmental devastation, and the failure of the frontier dream for so many. It provides a shared set of heroes and stories that reinforce a particular vision of the American character. While historians have worked for decades to deconstruct these myths, their pull on the popular imagination remains incredibly strong, a testament to our collective desire for a simple, heroic past. The process of demythologizing the West involves peeling back the layers of fiction to reveal a more complicated and far more interesting historical truth. This means moving beyond the simplistic narrative of cowboys and Indians to explore the lives of the diverse groups of people who actually inhabited the frontier. It requires acknowledging the stories of the Chinese railroad workers, the black cowboys, the Mexican vaqueros, and the female homesteaders. It means examining the economic systems that exploited labor and resources, and confronting the brutal realities of conquest and displacement. Demythologizing isn't about destroying heroes or denigrating the past. It's about replacing a one-dimensional caricature with a richer, more inclusive, and more accurate three-dimensional history. It allows us to see the West not as a monolithic legend, but as a dynamic and contested space where countless different stories unfolded. A more accurate understanding of the West requires us to abandon the simplistic morality of the classic Western genre. History is not a straightforward battle between good and evil. The settlers who moved west were not uniformly heroic pioneers. They were complex human beings, motivated by a wide range of factors, from a desire for a better life to greed and prejudice. The Native Americans who resisted them were not savage villains. They were people defending their homes, their cultures, and their way of life. Cowboys were not knights of the prairie, but low-wage laborers. By embracing this complexity, we can move beyond the cartoonish archetypes of the myth and begin to appreciate the genuine human dramas of the era. This more nuanced view allows us to understand the West as a place of profound moral ambiguity, where acts of incredible courage and kindness coexisted with acts of brutal violence and injustice. To truly understand the West, we must recognize it as a crossroads of cultures. It was never an empty wilderness, nor was it a homogeneous Anglo-American space. It was a place where diverse streams of humanity converged, collided, and mingled. The cultures of Native American nations, with their deep understanding of the land, intersected with those of Spanish and Mexican settlers who had established their own societies long before the arrival of the Anglos. Added to this mix were European immigrants, African Americans seeking opportunity outside the South, and Chinese laborers hoping to make their fortunes. This dynamic interplay of cultures shaped everything from the language and food of the region to its economic and social structures. The West was not the edge of civilization. It was a vibrant, multicultural center of interaction, a reality far richer and more complex than the myth allows. Re-examining the role of the federal government is crucial to deconstructing the myth of the ruggedly individualistic West. The idea that the frontier was settled by self-reliant individuals acting alone is a fiction. In reality, the federal government was the primary engine of westward expansion. It was the government that acquired the land through treaties and war, that subsidized the construction of the railroads with massive land grants, and that passed laws like the Homestead Act to encourage settlement. The U.S. Army played a key role in removing Native American populations and protecting settlers and corporate interests. Far from a story of individuals operating outside of government control, the settlement of the West was a state-sponsored project from start to finish. Acknowledging this central role challenges the core myth of self-reliance and reveals the deep interconnections between government policy and the westward movement. The environmental consequences of westward expansion are a critical part of the story that the traditional myth completely ignores. The romantic vision of pristine, untouched landscapes waiting to be settled masks a history of profound environmental transformation and, in many cases, devastation. The near extermination of the bison is the most dramatic example, but it was far from the only one. The rapid expansion of agriculture led to the plowing of native grasslands, resulting in soil erosion and the disruption of entire ecosystems. Mining operations scarred the landscape and polluted rivers with toxic runoff. The fur trade decimated beaver populations, altering the hydrology of entire regions. The frontier was not settled without cost. This period of rapid, unregulated expansion set in motion environmental changes whose consequences are still being dealt with today. A complex legacy that is entirely absent from the celebratory tales of taming the wilderness. The myth of the West is not just a historical artifact. It continues to shape modern American identity and politics in profound ways. The ideal of the rugged individualist, the cowboy who distrusts government and solves his own problems, remains a powerful force in American political discourse. This figure is often invoked in debates about everything from gun control and land use to social welfare programs. The belief in a self-reliant past fuels a modern political ideology that is often skeptical of collective action and federal authority. Similarly, the myth of boundless opportunity and the right to exploit natural resources continues to influence contemporary debates over environmental regulation and conservation. By understanding how these 19th century myths persist in the 21st century, we can gain a deeper insight into the enduring cultural and political currents that shape the modern United States. Our journey through the realities of the American West reveals a chasm between the world as it was and the world as it has been portrayed. We've dismantled the heroic facade to uncover a story of immense hardship where the greatest struggles were not against outlaws, but against disease, starvation, and economic exploitation. The romanticized figures of the myth, the long-lived gunfighter, the instantly wealthy prospector, the chivalrous cowboy dissolve when exposed to the harsh light of historical fact. The reality for most was a life that was brutally short, filled with monotonous labor, and offering little chance for the glorious adventures and easy fortunes promised in fiction. The West was not a simple stage for heroic deeds, but a complex and often tragic landscape where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges in their quest for survival. We have seen that the true antagonists of the frontier were not black-hatted villains, but the invisible and impersonal forces that shaped daily existence. The lack of basic sanitation and medical knowledge turned common illnesses into deadly plagues, making disease the single greatest cause of death. The nutritional deficiencies of a monotonous diet led to debilitating conditions like scurvy, slowly crippling and killing from within. The economic systems were heavily weighted in favor of powerful corporations and distant investors, trapping farmers, miners, and cowboys in cycles of debt and low-wage labor. The climate itself was a relentless adversary, with its droughts, blizzards, and insect plagues that could erase a year's work in an instant. These mundane but lethal realities, completely absent from the myth, were the true challenges that defined the struggle for life in the 19th century West. The heroic myth of the West, we have learned, was deliberately constructed and sold to the American public. It began with the sensationalized dime novels of the East Coast, which transformed real-life figures into fictional superheroes. It was then amplified and brought to life by master showmen like Buffalo Bill Cody, whose Wild West extravaganzas created a theatrical spectacle of a sanitized and action-packed frontier. Finally, Hollywood took this manufactured mythology and turned it into a cornerstone of American popular culture, broadcasting a simple, heroic, and morally unambiguous vision of the West to the entire world. This process was not an accident. It was the creation of a powerful and profitable entertainment product, a national folklore that prioritized adventure and simple morality over the complex and often uncomfortable truths of history. This carefully constructed myth served a powerful ideological purpose. It justified the nation's westward expansion by portraying it as a heroic and inevitable process of taming a savage wilderness, by casting settlers as brave pioneers and Native Americans as primitive obstacles. The myth erased the moral complexities of conquest and displacement. It celebrated a particular brand of rugged individualism that resonated with American ideals, while ignoring the central role of the federal government in driving and financing the expansion. In essence, the myth created a national origin story that was both flattering and self-serving, allowing the nation to see its history not as a story of violence and exploitation, but as a triumphant and divinely sanctioned adventure. This powerful narrative helped to unify a diverse nation and forge a shared sense of identity, even as it distorted the past. However, beneath the surface of this monolithic myth lies a much richer and more accurate story, one defined by its incredible diversity. The West was not just the domain of the white, Anglo-Saxon cowboy. It was a place where the lives and cultures of countless different groups intersected. It was a world shaped by the contributions and struggles of Chinese railroad workers, African American soldiers and settlers, Mexican vaqueros, whose traditions defined the cattle industry, and women who were not just passive bystanders, but active builders of their communities. The West was also home to hundreds of distinct Native American nations, each with its own language, culture, and history. Recognizing this multicultural reality is the first step toward a genuine understanding of the West, moving beyond the whitewashed fantasy to appreciate the complex tapestry of peoples who truly created its history. Confronting the true history of the American West means grappling with a legacy of violence and injustice that the myth conveniently ignores. This is a history marked by broken treaties with Native American nations and the systematic destruction of their way of life through military force and policies like the extermination of the bison. It's a history of racial discrimination against Chinese, Black, and Mexican populations who provided essential labor, but were denied equal rights and opportunities. It's a history of economic exploitation, where the wealth of the region was extracted by powerful interests, often at the expense of the working people who toiled in the mines, on the railroads, and on the cattle trails. Acknowledging these difficult truths is not about assigning blame, but about achieving a more honest and complete understanding of how the West was truly won. Ultimately, the story of the American West is a powerful reminder of how history is written and by whom. The dominant narrative, the one we know from movies and television, is a testament to the power of myth-making. It shows how stories can be crafted to serve particular interests, to create heroes and villains, and to shape a nation's understanding of its own past. But history is not static. By questioning these familiar tales and seeking out the voices and experiences that have been silenced or ignored, we can arrive at a more nuanced, more complex, and more truthful account. The real West, with all its contradictions, hardships, and diverse peoples, is a far more compelling and relevant story than the simple, heroic myth it was replaced with. So the next time you find yourself watching a classic Western with its dramatic sunsets and clear-cut morality, remember the complex reality that lies beneath the fantasy. Think of the real-life struggles against disease and starvation, the diversity of the people who inhabited the land, and the profound injustices that were an inseparable part of the story. The myth of the Wild West is a powerful and enduring part of American culture, but it is just that, a myth. The true history is a messier, more challenging, and ultimately more human story. By understanding the difference between the two, we gain not only a more accurate picture of the past, but also a deeper insight into the forces that continue to shape the present. The real West is still out there, waiting to be discovered, not in the frames of a film, but in the pages of history. The familiar narrative of the American West, so deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness, often begins with the iconic image of the lone prospector. We picture a determined individual with a mule and a pickaxe venturing into the untamed wilderness, driven by dreams of discovering a mother lode that will bring instant, fabulous wealth. This powerful archetype, central to the gold rush mythos, champions the idea of rugged individualism and the promise of a fortune earned through sheer grit and a little bit of luck. It's a compelling story of adventure and personal triumph. However, this romanticized vision almost completely obscures the much more common and far less glamorous reality. For the vast majority who chased the glimmer of gold, the dream was a siren song that led not to riches, but to hardship, disappointment, and often an early grave. The story of the prospector is less a tale of success and more a cautionary lesson in speculation and desperation. The reality for the average gold seeker was a life of relentless, backbreaking toil with vanishingly small returns. The initial placer deposits the loose gold found in stream beds were exhausted with surprising speed, scooped up by the earliest arrivals. Those who came later, the vast majority of 49ers, were confronted with a far more formidable challenge: extracting gold embedded deep within solid rock. This type of hard rock mining required immense capital for machinery, explosives, and labor, putting it far beyond the reach of the individual prospector. Consequently, most miners were forced to abandon their dreams of independence and become wage laborers for large, well-financed mining corporations. They traded the fantasy of striking it rich for the grim reality of dangerous work, low pay, and deplorable living conditions, their labor enriching distant stockholders rather than themselves. The true financial winners of the gold rush were not the men who wielded the pickaxes, but the shrewd and opportunistic merchants who supplied them. These entrepreneurs understood a fundamental economic truth. In a gold rush, the most reliable way to mine gold is to mine the miners. While prospectors gambled on the slim chance of a lucky strike, merchants established a steady and lucrative trade, selling essential goods at wildly inflated prices. A man like Sam Brannett, who became California's first millionaire, achieved his fortune not by panning for gold, but by cornering the market on shovels, picks, and other basic supplies. Levi Strauss built an empire by recognizing the miner's need for durable work pants. These merchants faced far less risk and reaped far greater rewards, building lasting fortunes on the hopes and desperation of the thousands who flocked to the gold fields in search of a dream that, for most, would remain forever out of reach. The romanticized figure of the cowboy, the quintessential hero of the American West, is often depicted as a free-spirited adventurer and master of his own destiny. This image, however, is a dramatic departure from the historical reality. The life of a 19th century cowboy was fundamentally that of a low-wage, migratory agricultural worker for an average pay of about $25 to $40 a month. These men endured months of grueling labor, extreme weather, and constant danger on the long cattle drives They were the expendable workforce of a vast and profitable industry, but they reaped almost none of its rewards. The immense profits generated by bringing a herd of cattle from Texas to the railheads in Kansas flowed directly into the pockets of the cattle barons and East Coast investors who owned the livestock and financed the operations, leaving the cowboys with little to show for their perilous work. The cattle drive, immortalized in Western lore as a grand adventure, was in reality a protracted ordeal fraught with constant peril. The greatest fear was the stampede, a terrifying and chaotic event that could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or the scent of a predator. A panicked herd of thousands of cattle was an unstoppable force of nature, capable of trampling men and horses in its path and scattering the herd for miles. The financial loss from a major stampede could be catastrophic for the cattle owner, but for the cowboy on night watch, the immediate risk was to his own life. Beyond stampedes, cowboys faced the dangers of treacherous river crossings where unpredictable currents could sweep away men and cattle alike, and the constant threat of deadly lightning strikes on the open prairie. These were not thrilling adventures, but life and death struggles, a routine part of a job where survival was never guaranteed. The Homestead Act of 1862 stands as a landmark piece of legislation, promising a 160-acre plot of land to any settler willing to brave the frontier and cultivate it for 5 years. It was promoted as a democratic ideal, a pathway for the common person to achieve independence and prosperity. This alluring promise fueled a massive wave of migration to the Great Plains. However, the dream of a successful homestead proved tragically elusive for many. The legislation failed to account for the harsh realities of the plains environment, where 160 acres was often not enough land to sustain a family farm. Settlers were confronted with a litany of challenges that the promotional literature conveniently omitted: relentless drought, brutal winters, and a profound sense of isolation that could break even the strongest spirits. The promise of free land was a powerful lure, but it led countless families into a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. The litany of hardships faced by homesteaders was long and unforgiving, turning the dream of frontier independence into a daily battle for existence. The unforgiving climate was a primary adversary. Searing summer droughts could wither crops in the fields, while the brutal winters brought blizzards and blue northers that could trap families in their sod houses for weeks on end, with starvation a constant threat. The very land itself presented a challenge, as the tough prairie sod broke plows and spirits alike. Yet perhaps the most terrifying and demoralizing scourge was the periodic plagues of grasshoppers, descending in swarms so thick they blotted out the sun. These insects would consume everything in their path: crops, gardens, clothing, wooden tool handles, leaving behind a landscape of utter devastation. For many, these overwhelming challenges proved insurmountable, forcing them to abandon their claims and retreat eastward with their dreams in tatters. Official statistics paint a grim picture of the homesteading experience, revealing a staggering rate of failure that belies the romantic myth of the triumphant pioneer. It is estimated that more than half, and in some areas as high as 60% of all homestead claims, were never proved up. This means that the majority of settlers who set out with high hopes were ultimately unable to meet the law's requirements of cultivating the land for 5 years. They were forced to abandon their farms, defeated by the combined forces of drought, debt, insect plagues, and crushing isolation. This high failure rate represents a massive, though often overlooked, human tragedy. It speaks to a story not of conquest and success, but of widespread disappointment and economic ruin, as hundreds of thousands of families invested their life savings and years of backbreaking labor into a dream that the harsh realities of the Great Plains simply would not permit. The railroads, often celebrated as the iron arteries of westward expansion, held a paradoxical and often predatory relationship with the very farmers they enabled. While the trains were essential for transporting crops to distant markets, the railroad companies wielded immense and unregulated power. Having been granted vast swaths of land and effective monopolies by the government, they were in a position to exploit the farmers who depended on them. The most common tool of this exploitation was the practice of differential pricing and exorbitant freight rates. Railroads would offer cheaper rates for long-haul routes where competition existed, while charging ruinously high prices for short-haul routes where farmers had no alternative. This price gouging could consume the entirety of a farmer's profit margin, leaving them trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, and fueling a powerful wave of agrarian populist anger that would eventually sweep across the nation. The systematic exploitation of farmers by the railroad monopolies did not go unchallenged. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, a powerful wave of agrarian protest began to build, giving rise to organizations like the Grange and the Farmers' Alliance. These groups were born of shared hardship and a collective sense of injustice. They organized farmers into a potent political force, advocating for government regulation of the railroads to ensure fair and equitable freight rates. Their activism represented a fundamental challenge to the era's prevailing laissez-faire ideology. The farmers argued that entities as powerful and essential as railroads could not be left to their own devices, but must be subject to public oversight for the common good. This populist uprising laid the groundwork for future reforms and represented a crucial chapter in the ongoing American debate over the role of government in regulating corporate power. The familiar, whitewashed cast of characters in the traditional Western myth represents a profound historical erasure. The frontier was, in reality, a remarkably diverse and multicultural space, a meeting ground of peoples from across the globe. The narrative that focuses almost exclusively on white settlers and cowboys ignores the essential contributions and complex experiences of a multitude of other groups. To understand the West, one must include the stories of the Chinese immigrants who built the railroads, the African American soldiers and cowboys who sought opportunity far from the segregated South, and the Mexican vaqueros whose long-established traditions formed the very foundation of the American cattle industry. Furthermore, the West was the ancestral home of hundreds of distinct Native American nations whose presence and perspective are fundamental to the story. Recognizing this diversity is not simply a matter of political correctness. It is a prerequisite for historical accuracy. The monumental task of building the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad was accomplished through the grueling and often lethal labor of an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese immigrants. These workers were recruited to take on the most dangerous and difficult jobs, including the terrifying work of blasting and tunneling through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains, for which they were paid significantly less than their white counterparts. They faced relentless racism and were subjected to deplorable working and living conditions. Hundreds lost their lives to explosions, landslides, avalanches, and disease, their bodies often buried in unmarked graves along the tracks they had laid, despite their indispensable contribution to one of America's greatest engineering achievements. Their role was minimized in the celebrations that followed and has been largely marginalized in the popular historical narrative ever since, a stark example of labor exploitation and racial injustice. One of the most significant historical inaccuracies perpetuated by the classic Western is the almost complete invisibility of the black cowboy. The reality is that the cattle trails of the post-Civil War era were a remarkably integrated workspace. Historians estimate that at least 1 in 4 of the cowboys who worked the great cattle drives out of Texas was African American. Many were recently freed slaves who brought with them a lifetime of experience in handling cattle and horses, skills that were in high demand. While life on the trail offered a level of freedom and equality of responsibility rarely found elsewhere, in 19th century America, prejudice was not entirely absent. Black cowboys often received lower pay and faced segregation once they reached the cattle towns. Their presence, however, is an undeniable fact that fundamentally challenges the myth of a purely white frontier and reveals a more complex and integrated story of the American West. Nat Love, also known by his famous moniker Deadwood Dick, stands as a powerful symbol of the African American experience in the West. His life story directly refuting the whitewashed cowboy myth. Born into slavery in Tennessee, Love headed west after the Civil War, seeking a life of freedom and adventure. He found it as a cowboy, working for cattle outfits in Texas and Arizona. He became a skilled marksman, an expert horseman, and a respected trail hand. In his 1907 autobiography, Love chronicled his life of adventure, including tales of shootouts, cattle drives, and winning rodeo competitions in Deadwood, South Dakota. While his accounts were likely embellished in the tradition of the era's tall tales, his life story provides invaluable first-hand insight into the world of the black cowboy and serves as a crucial historical counter-narrative to a genre that has, for too long, rendered him and thousands of others like him invisible. The end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 set in motion a profound and often tragic transformation for the Hispanic people of the newly acquired American Southwest. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which concluded the war, contained provisions that promised to respect the property rights and cultural autonomy of the Mexican citizens who chose to remain. These guarantees, however, were systematically and tragically undermined through a complex web of legal maneuvering, discriminatory laws, and outright intimidation. Anglo-American lawyers, politicians, and settlers gradually dispossessed thousands of Californios and other Hispanic landowners of their ancestral ranchos. The requirement to prove their long-held land grants in a foreign and biased U.S. court system proved ruinously expensive and ultimately impossible for many, leading to a massive and unjust transfer of land and wealth that reshaped the region's social and economic order. The dispossession of Mexican landowners in the Southwest was not simply a matter of bad luck. It was a systematic process driven by legal and economic pressure. The Land Act of 1851, for example, required all holders of Spanish and Mexican land grants to present their claims before a federal board. This process was intentionally complex, lengthy, and expensive, forcing many rancheros to hire American lawyers and take on massive debt, often mortgaging their own land to pay the legal fees. Even when their claims were eventually upheld, a process that could take over a decade, the legal costs were often so high that they were forced to sell their land to pay them off. This, combined with the imposition of heavy new property taxes and the squatting and encroachment of Anglo settlers, created a perfect storm that stripped land from its traditional owners and concentrated it in the hands of newly arrived Americans. Contrary to the stereotype of the West as a purely masculine world, the frontier often provided women with legal and political opportunities that were far more progressive than those available in the more established, civilized East. In an effort to attract female settlers and create stable, family-oriented communities, many Western territories and states became pioneers in advancing women's rights. They were among the first to pass Married Women's Property Acts, which dismantled the old legal doctrine of feme covert and allowed married women to own, control, and dispose of property in their own name. This legal innovation was a radical departure from the norm in the rest of the country and represented a pragmatic recognition of women's crucial role as active and equal partners in the demanding enterprise of building a new society. The most dramatic example of the progressive nature of women's rights on the frontier came in 1869, when the legislature of the Wyoming Territory granted all adult women the right to vote and hold public office. This groundbreaking decision, made a full half-century before the 19th Amendment extended suffrage to women nationwide, was motivated by a complex mix of factors. Some legislators held genuine beliefs in gender equality, while others saw it as a clever promotional tactic to attract more female settlers to the sparsely populated territory. There was also a hope that women voters would help to civilize the rough-and-tumble frontier culture. Regardless of the motivations, the result was a historic milestone. When Wyoming sought statehood 2 decades later, its legislature famously declared that it would rather remain a territory for 100 years than join the Union without its women, solidifying its legacy as the equality state. One of the most enduring and misleading myths of the American West is the image of a land awash in gun violence, where shootouts were a daily occurrence on lawless streets. The historical reality, however, is that the most famous and wildest of the frontier towns, places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood, actually had some of the nation's most stringent gun control regulations. Recognizing that unchecked violence was detrimental to commerce and community stability, city leaders passed and strictly enforced ordinances that prohibited the carrying of firearms within town limits. Upon arriving, cowboys and other travelers were legally required to deposit their guns with the sheriff or a local business until they left. The cinematic high noon duel was an exceptionally rare event. A person was far more likely to be a victim of disease or accident than a gunfight. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, is often held up as the quintessential example of Old West violence. Yet, the true story of this event is a perfect illustration of the reality of frontier gun laws. The shootout did not occur because Tombstone was a lawless town, but precisely because it had laws against carrying firearms in public. The conflict was sparked when Virgil Earp, the town's chief marshal, decided to enforce this ordinance against the Clanton and McLaury brothers, who were openly armed in violation of the law. The resulting shootout was not a heroic duel, but a chaotic, brutal, and legally contentious affair that lasted about 30 seconds. It was a bloody street fight rooted in local politics, personal rivalries, and the enforcement of a gun control ordinance, a far cry from the simple, honorable showdown of cinematic legend. When established legal institutions were perceived as weak, distant, or corrupt, frontier communities frequently resorted to their own form of extralegal justice, creating what became known as vigilance committees. These groups were typically composed of prominent local citizens, merchants, ranchers, and other civic leaders who took the law into their own hands to protect their property and impose order. Operating outside the bounds of due process, these vigilantes would often round up suspected horse thieves, rustlers, and other outlaws, subjecting them to swift and summary trials that almost invariably ended with a death sentence carried out at the end of a rope. While participants saw themselves as righteous agents of communal justice, their actions represented a form of organized mob rule, where the line between suppressing crime and settling personal scores was dangerously thin. The activities of vigilante groups, while often effective in driving out criminal elements, existed in a deep moral and legal gray area. Their actions, by definition, bypassed the established legal system, denying the accused the fundamental rights of a proper trial, legal counsel, and the presumption of innocence. The power of a vigilante committee could easily be abused, used to eliminate business competitors, settle personal grudges, or enforce a particular social or racial hierarchy. The San Francisco Vigilance Committees of the 1,850, for example, became a powerful political force, deposing elected officials and effectively running the city for a time. These episodes highlight a central tension of the frontier, the struggle to establish order in a chaotic environment, and the profound danger of abandoning the rule of law, even for what may seem like the best of reasons. The romantic narrative of westward expansion as a heroic pioneering adventure serves to mask a much darker and more violent reality: the systematic conquest and dispossession of Native American peoples. This was not a story of valiant settlers defending themselves against savage aggressors, but rather a prolonged campaign of ethnic cleansing, driven by government policy and popular racism. The concept of manifest destiny provided a moral justification for a brutal process of land theft, forced relocation, and cultural destruction. The U.S. Army, far from being a neutral peacekeeping force, acted as the primary instrument of this conquest, waging total war against tribes that resisted the relentless encroachment upon their ancestral lands. To understand the West, one must confront this history of state-sanctioned violence and its devastating, multi-generational impact on indigenous communities. The long and tragic history of U.S. Native American relations is littered with the wreckage of broken treaties. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. government negotiated and signed hundreds of legally binding treaties with sovereign native nations, almost always guaranteeing them title to specific lands in perpetuity. However, these solemn promises were routinely and cynically violated, As soon as the land in question became desirable to white settlers, railroad companies, or mineral prospectors, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, for instance, explicitly granted the Great Sioux Nation ownership of the sacred Black Hills. Just a few years later, the discovery of gold prompted the government to send in the army, break the treaty, and seize the land by force. This consistent pattern of duplicity and bad faith bred deep mistrust, and was a primary driver of the violent conflicts that defined the so-called Indian Wars. One of the most brutal and effective strategies in the war against the Plains Indians was the deliberate, government-sanctioned extermination of the American bison. The vast buffalo herds were the economic, cultural, and spiritual foundation of Plains Indian life, providing everything from food and shelter to tools and religious items. U.S. military and political leaders, including General Philip Sheridan, recognized that the elimination of the buffalo was the quickest way to force the free-roaming Plains tribes onto reservations and make them dependent on government handouts. This policy unleashed a wave of commercial hunters who slaughtered the animals by the millions, often taking only the hides and leaving the rest of the carcass to rot. By the end of the 1880s, the once thundering herds, which had numbered in the tens of millions, were reduced to a few hundred survivors, and the Plains culture that depended on them was shattered. Following the brutal military campaigns, the U.S. government implemented a new strategy aimed at assimilating Native Americans into white society, a policy of cultural rather than physical annihilation. The cornerstone of this effort was the off-reservation boarding school system, epitomized by the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded in Pennsylvania in 1879. The school's mission, articulated with chilling clarity by its founder, Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. This philosophy was put into practice by forcibly removing children from their families and communities and immersing them in a rigid, militaristic environment designed to systematically strip them of their indigenous identity. It was a calculated program of cultural erasure disguised as a benevolent educational enterprise that inflicted deep, lasting trauma on generations of Native children and their families. Life at boarding schools like Carlisle was a traumatic experience designed to sever every tie to a child's native culture. Upon arrival, children were subjected to a humiliating ordeal. Their traditional clothing was replaced with uniforms. Their long hair, often a symbol of cultural and spiritual significance, was unceremoniously cut short, and they were given English names, forbidden from ever using their own again. The speaking of their native languages was strictly prohibited and often met with harsh physical punishment. The curriculum focused on vocational training for boys and domestic skills for girls, preparing them for a life of manual labor at the lowest rungs of white society. This forced assimilation created a profound sense of alienation and cultural dislocation, leaving students caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither, a legacy of psychological damage that echoed for generations. The invention of the American West, as we know it in popular culture, was driven not by historians, but by the mass-market entertainment industry of the 19th century. The primary vehicle for this myth-making was the dime novel, a form of cheap, sensationalized paperback fiction that exploded in popularity after the Civil War. These novels fed an insatiable public appetite for adventure, presenting a highly romanticized and wildly inaccurate vision of frontier life. They were filled with tales of heroic gunslingers, noble savages, dastardly villains, and daring rescues. Real-life individuals like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane were transformed into legendary figures, their actual lives and deeds embellished beyond all recognition to fit the dramatic formulas of the genre, creating a powerful set of archetypes that would define the West in the popular imagination for a century to come. No single individual was more instrumental in crafting and popularizing the myth of the Wild West than William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, a genuine frontier figure who had worked as a scout and bison hunter. Cody possessed an unparalleled genius for showmanship. In 1883, he launched his Wild West show, a massive, traveling spectacle that brought a theatrical and highly sanitized version of the frontier to audiences across the United States and Europe. The show was a dazzling display of horsemanship, sharpshooting, and dramatic reenactments of famous battles, stagecoach robberies, and buffalo hunts. It was pure entertainment, carefully choreographed to thrill and amaze, and it cemented a specific, action-packed vision of the West in the minds of millions, a vision that had far more to do with show business than with historical reality. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was not presented as fiction, but as an authentic recreation of life on the frontier, a claim that gave it immense cultural power. By hiring real-life legendary figures like the sharpshooter Annie Oakley and the Lakota leader Sitting Bull to perform in his shows, Cody blurred the lines between history and entertainment. Audiences believed they were witnessing the real West, when in fact they were watching a carefully curated performance designed to conform to the heroic myths. The show's narrative consistently portrayed the white frontiersmen as heroic civilizers, and the Native Americans as noble but dangerous savages, reenacting battles in which the Indians were always defeated. This theatrical framing solidified a romantic, conflict-driven, and ultimately false narrative of the West, one that celebrated conquest and conveniently ignored the brutal complexities of the era. As the 20th century dawned, the new medium of motion pictures quickly seized upon the myths created by dime novels and Wild West shows, making the Western the dominant genre of American cinema for half a century. Early films like Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, 1903, established the core narrative conventions, a clear and simple conflict between heroic cowboys and villainous outlaws set against a dramatic and sparsely populated landscape. This cinematic West was a fantasy space, a moral playground where complex historical issues were flattened into straightforward tales of good versus evil. The messy realities of history, the economic hardship, the ethnic diversity, the genocide of native peoples, were almost entirely excluded in favor of action sequences and heroic posturing, creating a powerful and enduring national folklore that was entertaining, patriotic, and profoundly misleading. The Hollywood Western became more than just an action genre. It evolved into a vehicle for exploring and affirming a particular set of American ideals. The figure of the lone, self-reliant cowboy, a man of integrity who stood apart from the corrupting influences of society, became a powerful national symbol of individualism. The vast, open landscapes of the cinematic West came to represent the promise of American freedom, manifest destiny, and endless opportunity, especially during the Cold War. The Western served as a national allegory, with the steadfast lawman representing the forces of democratic order, holding firm against the threat of chaos and tyranny. By projecting these values onto a mythologized past, the genre created a powerful and reassuring national origin story, one that celebrated the very traits the nation most wished to see in itself. There is a stark and brutal disconnect between the stylized gunfights of Hollywood films and the reality of violence on the 19th century frontier. The cinematic gunfight is a choreographed ballet of honor and skill, a dramatic duel where the hero, a reluctant but expert marksman, triumphs in the name of justice. Historical violence, however, was typically ugly, chaotic, and devoid of honor. Death was far more likely to come from a drunken brawl that got out of hand, a knife in the back in a dark alley, or a clumsy, accidental discharge of a firearm. The romanticized duel at high noon was almost entirely a fictional invention. This cinematic obsession with gunplay creates a deeply distorted picture of mortality, glorifying a relatively rare form of violence, while completely ignoring the mundane and far more deadly threats of disease, accident, and malnutrition that truly defined the frontier experience. The cinematic cowboy is an icon of virtue and honor, a chivalrous hero who protects the innocent and always fights on the side of right. This idealized portrait is almost entirely a creation of the silver screen, bearing little resemblance to the historical reality. The 19th century cowboy was, in essence, a poorly paid, itinerant farmhand, engaged in a dangerous and physically exhausting occupation. The workforce was composed largely of young men, many of them uneducated, and included a significant number of drifters and individuals with checkered pasts. The code of chivalry, so prominent in the films, was largely absent from the rough, male-dominated culture of the cattle trails and cow towns. The cowboy's life was one of grit, poverty, and hardship, a reality that the heroic myth conveniently erases in favor of a clean, simple, and inspiring fantasy. Perhaps the most damaging legacy of the classic Western genre is its deeply racist and dehumanizing portrayal of Native Americans. For decades, films depicted them not as members of diverse and complex societies, but as a monolithic, primitive, and bloodthirsty horde. They were consistently cast as the savage other and obstacle to the inevitable and righteous march of American civilization. This caricature was not just a matter of ignorance, it served a vital narrative function. By portraying Native peoples as inhuman aggressors, the films could present the violent history of conquest, not as a campaign of ethnic cleansing, but as a heroic story of brave pioneers defending their families and taming a hostile wilderness. This cinematic slander justified past atrocities and perpetuated harmful stereotypes that have endured for generations, profoundly shaping public perception and policy. At its core, the classic Western is a cinematic celebration of manifest destiny, the 19th century belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion across the North American continent. The genre consistently frames the process of westward expansion as the noble and inevitable taming of an empty wilderness. This narrative deliberately ignores the fact that the West was already home to hundreds of sovereign native nations and well-established Hispanic societies. It recasts invasion and conquest as pioneering settlement, and it transforms the violent displacement of entire peoples into a natural and progressive historical development. By embedding this ideology into its very structure, the Western genre created a powerful and self-serving national mythology that validated American expansionism and wrote its victims out of the story. The physical environment of the typical Hollywood Western is as much a fantasy as its characters and plots. The movie town is usually a quaint and tidy collection of buildings on a single dusty street. The real frontier settlements, whether they were cattle towns or mining camps, were filthy, chaotic, and dangerous places. Streets were often mires of mud and animal waste, with no sanitation systems to speak of. The air would have been thick with the stench of garbage, open latrines, and animal slaughterhouses. The romanticized saloon was often a squalid dive that served as a brothel and gambling den, frequented by exhausted and often desperate men. The greatest daily threat was not a gunfight, but the constant risk of contracting a deadly disease like cholera or typhoid, which thrived in the unsanitary conditions. The cinematic West cleans up this grim reality, presenting an orderly and picturesque version of places that were, in fact, squalid and dangerous. The economic world of the Western myth is deceptively simple, focusing on the individual efforts of prospectors and cowboys. This narrative completely overlooks the rise of corporate capitalism, which quickly came to dominate the frontier's vast natural resources. The independent miner was soon replaced by large mining companies that employed laborers for low wages in perilous conditions. The open range, once the domain of small-time ranchers, was consolidated under the control of powerful cattle barons and their distant East Coast and European investors. And the railroads, the ultimate corporate behemoths of the era, leveraged their government-granted monopolies to exploit farmers and control the economic life of the region. The myth of the rugged individualist conquering the frontier on his own terms masks the truer story of the West as America's first great resource colony, a place where corporate power, not individual effort, ultimately triumphed. While the classic Western occasionally features memorable female characters, it overwhelmingly consigns them to a handful of restrictive and stereotypical roles. A woman in a Western is typically either the virtuous schoolmarm, who represents the civilizing influence of the East, the fallen but kind-hearted saloon girl in need of redemption, or the helpless rancher's daughter, who exists primarily to be rescued by the male hero. This narrow and simplistic portrayal entirely fails to capture the diverse and essential roles that real women played on the frontier. Women were homesteaders, ranchers, business owners, doctors, writers, and political reformers. They were active and indispensable partners in the creation of Western society. By reducing them to one-dimensional archetypes, the traditional Western myth erases their agency and contributions, presenting a fundamentally skewed and incomplete vision of the past. The concept of law and order in the cinematic West is typically embodied in the figure of the lone, heroic sheriff who single-handedly brings justice to a lawless town. This popular trope ignores the complex, often contradictory, and pluralistic legal landscape of the actual frontier. Formal legal institutions were often weak, underfunded, and slow to establish themselves. In their absence, a variety of informal legal codes emerged, from the unwritten rules of the cattle drive to the brutal summary justice of vigilante committees. Moreover, the formal law was frequently not a neutral arbiter of justice, but a tool used to advance the interests of the powerful. It was manipulated to dispossess Mexican landowners of their property and to legitimize the violation of treaties with Native American nations. The simple cinematic myth of the righteous lawman masks a far more complicated reality of legal improvisation, institutional weakness, and systemic injustice. The remarkable endurance of the Western myth speaks to its profound success in creating a simplified and morally unambiguous origin story for the United States. It is a narrative that celebrates individualism, presents westward expansion as a heroic national project, and frames the associated violence as a necessary and justifiable part of progress. This comforting story smooths over the deeply troubling aspects of the nation's history: the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, and the frequent failure of the frontier dream. It provides a shared cast of heroes and a common set of stories that reinforce a particular, flattering vision of the American character. Despite decades of historical work aimed at deconstructing this mythology, its powerful grip on the popular imagination remains a testament to the deep-seated human desire for a past that is simple, heroic, and inspiring. The important work of demythologizing the American West is an ongoing process of replacing a one-dimensional fiction with a more complex and accurate historical truth. This requires moving beyond the narrow focus on white male heroes to explore the lives and perspectives of all the diverse peoples who shaped the region. It means incorporating the stories of the Chinese laborers who laid the tracks, the black cowboys who rode the range, the Mexican vaqueros who invented the craft, and the female homesteaders who built the communities. It also demands a critical examination of the exploitative economic systems that drove expansion and a frank confrontation with the brutal realities of conquest. Demythologizing is not about erasing heroes, but about trading a simple caricature for a richer, more inclusive, and more honest three-dimensional history that does justice to the complexity of the past. A more truthful understanding of the West necessitates abandoning the simplistic good versus evil morality that defines the classic Western genre. History is never a clean fight between heroes and villains. The Anglo settlers who migrated westward were complex individuals motivated by a mix of noble aspirations for a better life and less noble impulses like greed and racial prejudice. The Native American tribes who resisted their encroachment were not monolithic savages, but people from hundreds of distinct nations, fighting to defend their families, their homes, and their entire way of life. By embracing this moral and historical complexity, we can move beyond the cartoonish archetypes of the myth and begin to appreciate the genuine and often tragic human dramas of the era. This nuanced perspective reveals the West as a place of profound moral ambiguity, where incredible courage and devastating injustice often walked hand in hand. To truly comprehend the history of the American West, we must see it not as the edge of civilization, but as a vibrant and contested crossroads of cultures. It was never an empty land waiting to be claimed. For centuries, it was the home of diverse and sophisticated Native American societies. It was then shaped by the arrival of Spanish and Mexican colonists who established their own distinct cultures and communities long before the Anglos arrived. The westward expansion of the United States brought new waves of people into this mix: European immigrants, African Americans seeking freedom from the oppression of the South and Asian laborers seeking economic opportunity. The West was the dynamic space where all these groups converged, competed, and mingled. This story of cultural interaction and conflict is infinitely richer and more consequential than the simplistic myth of a lone pioneer taming a wilderness. A critical element in dismantling the Western myth is reevaluating the role of the federal government. The popular narrative of the rugged individualist succeeding on his own is largely a fiction. In truth, the federal government was the primary architect and sponsor of westward expansion. It was the government that acquired the vast territories through war and treaties, that provided the legal framework for settlement through acts like the Homestead Act, and that subsidized the construction of the transportation infrastructure with massive land grants to railroad corporations. Most crucially, the U.S. Army was the instrument that forcibly removed Native American populations to make way for settlement and protect American economic interests. The story of the West is not one of limited government, but of a powerful and active state projecting its authority across a continent. The romantic and celebratory myth of the West completely ignores the profound and often devastating environmental consequences of westward expansion. The narrative of taming the wilderness masks a history of ecological transformation that was frequently destructive. The near extinction of the American bison is the most famous example, but the environmental impact was far broader. The rapid conversion of native grasslands to agriculture led to massive soil erosion and the disruption of entire ecosystems, contributing to disasters like the Dust Bowl. In a later generation, industrial mining practices scarred landscapes and choked rivers with toxic waste. The lucrative fur trade led to the decimation of beaver populations, which in turn altered the hydrology of countless western rivers. This legacy of environmental degradation, a direct result of the rapid and unregulated exploitation of resources, is a crucial and often forgotten part of the story of the West. The mythology of the American West is not merely a historical curiosity. It remains a potent and active force in shaping modern American culture and politics. The ideal of the rugged individualist, the self-reliant cowboy who is skeptical of government and solves his own problems, continues to be a powerful archetype in contemporary debates about everything from healthcare and social safety nets to gun control and federal land use. This romanticized vision of a self-sufficient past fuels a modern political ideology that often distrusts collective action and celebrates individual enterprise above all else. Understanding the historical roots of this myth provides crucial insight into the enduring cultural and political divisions that characterize the United States today, demonstrating how stories about the past continue to shape the arguments we have about the future. As our exploration concludes, we are left with a stark contrast between the West of myth and the West of reality. We have stripped away the heroic veneer to find a history defined by profound hardship, where the most formidable enemies were not gunslinging outlaws, but the invisible forces of disease, malnutrition, and economic exploitation. The iconic figures of the legend, the invincible lawman, the instantly rich prospector, the honorable cowboy, are revealed to be largely fictional creations. The historical record shows that, for the vast majority of people who went west, Life was a story of relentless toil, frequent disappointment, and a tragically low life expectancy. The West was not a grand stage for adventure, but a complex and often brutal environment where ordinary people faced an extraordinary and often losing battle for survival. In this more truthful history, the antagonists are not individuals, but impersonal forces. The absence of sanitation and modern medicine made disease a far more prolific killer than any outlaw. The monotonous and nutritionally deficient diet common on the frontier led to slow, agonizing deaths from illnesses like scurvy. The economic structure was heavily rigged in favor of powerful corporate interests, leaving farmers, miners, and cowboys with little to show for their labor. And the very climate of the West, with its cycles of drought, flood, and blizzard, was a constant and unforgiving adversary. These mundane but lethal realities, which have no place in the romantic myth, were the true defining challenges of life and death in the 19th century West, shaping the lives of its inhabitants far more than any dramatic shootout. Ultimately, the enduring myth of the American West stands as a powerful case study in how national identity is constructed through storytelling. It demonstrates how a complex, often brutal, and morally ambiguous history can be transformed into a simple, heroic, and reassuring narrative. This mythology was not an organic growth, but a deliberate creation of a burgeoning entertainment industry that prioritized drama over accuracy. It crafted a story that celebrated individualism and justified conquest, a story that became a cornerstone of American identity. But by pulling back the curtain, by listening to the silenced voices, and confronting the uncomfortable truths, we discover a history that is far messier, more diverse, and more profound. The real West, in all its tragic and inspiring complexity, is a story that still has much to teach us about who we were and who we are.